presume that many people are beginning to log on. So I want to present to you the title of what we're doing this afternoon: Ending Anti-Blackness in Latinx Communities. That's the title of our program. And we've collected a number of speakers. Many of them are community activists. And we'll be talking about issues which began to appear, I would say, maybe, and as many of you know, approximately back in June, 2 months ago or so, 2 or 3 months ago. And these were quite serious issues. Things were occurring in La Vita, in Cicero, Humboldt Park, between Latino communities and African-American communities. And what we wanted to do at the time, our Chancellor's Committee on the Status of Latinos decided to initiate a discussion. And two of the people particularly who were behind that discussion were Claribel Gomez and David Marquez. And David is with us in the background. But anyway, after all of those discussions, those were the sorts of things which began to emerge. We wanted to put this together. We went to the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. They're providing us the internet services and other kinds of logistical sorts of things. So what I'm going to do pretty soon, I'm going to start inviting the speakers to introduce themselves, to tell us a little bit about who they are. But before I do that, I simply want to mention to all of the attendees that if you can disable your own chat features, that would be handy. You'll be able to ask questions when we get to the question and answer feature, or you'll be able to tap into the question and answer feature on Zoom. And you can address the question to a specific panelist if that question is for one of our panelists. Otherwise, you can just address it to everyone. And we'll keep monitoring those questions. We'll try to answer all of the questions that are possible. There's a lot of attendees, we think, so we probably will not be able to get to every question, but we're going to try. We're going to be recording this event, so all of this will be posted online, and we'll send out the link later on through email to everyone who is subscribed, who is registered for the program. If there should be any kind of technical difficulties, please bear with us. We'll try to solve that. And finally, we'll try to be limiting each of our panelists to about 5 to 7 minutes for some original or some beginning kind of discussion. And then after they have all spoken, we will open up the remainder of the event to questions and discussion among all of us. So again, let me welcome you. My name is Ralph Cintron. I am the chairman of the, I'm the director of the Latin American Latino Studies program. And very happy to have you here. So I want to start off with different people. I'm going to go down the list that I have here that's in front of me. I'm going to start off with Regina. If you could unmute yourself, Regina, and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Hi, I'm Regina Russell. I am the co-chair of Chicago Alliance Against Racism and Political Oppression. And I'm also on the Mamas, and I'm also a member of CFIS of Chicago.
She is a mother of a police torture survivor, Taman Russell. She's a proud leader of the SEIU 73 and co-chair of the Labor Committee of the Chicago Alliance. against racist and police repression. Regina, do you want to go ahead and give us an opening statement for yourself?
Okay. How I got involved in getting involved in this work. I was the only child of a divorced black woman on the south side of Chicago. And I learned at an early age that Black and brown people were treated differently than whites. But I was always told that you need to work hard for anything that you wanted. So my mother was a chief union steward with the International Brotherhood of Electricians, which I would always go to, union steward meetings, protests regarding unfair work practices. She was very outspoken, and she always stood up for people who were treated unfairly. At these meetings, I witnessed employees demanding better working experiences, better working conditions, pay and respect, for management. Can you believe that 5 decades later, and workers are still demanding the same things? That's kind of crazy. So it's no surprise that I followed my mother's footsteps and become an elected union steward, member of the executive board at SEIU Local 73, and for the last 17 years, where I continue to fight for workers' rights. Also, my son was, I'm gonna back up a minute. Okay, how I came to the Alliance. My friend Joe Osbaker, a union brother, invited me to a meeting of the Chicago Alliance of Racist and Political Oppression. I really had never heard of the organization, so I was kind of leery of where I was going and what was going to happen. But when I got there, I learned that this group was actively trying to change the lives of torture victims and people that were wrongly convicted, which I didn't know that my son was wrongly convicted, so that really touched my heart. So I got involved. And they also were trying to change the legislation. They want to have a civilian police accountability commission, which means that people will police the police in their neighborhoods. That instead of the police policing the police, which that doesn't happen, you would have people in their community. If a police somebody said that they tortured them, they did something, then they would go to the individuals in that community and they would do the investigation and they would decide what would happen, because now nothing happens to them. So, okay, I'm gonna stop now. I think I'm over my 7 minutes.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you very much. I want to introduce Bertha Escamilla, next. She's the mother of a police torture survivor, Nick Escamilla. She's a longtime activist as well on the violence and injustices of police and courts in Chicagoland. She's a member of the campaign to free incarcerated survivors of police torture, the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Police Repression. And she's also a member of the group Mothers of the Kidnapped, which is a subgroup of mamas activating movements for abolition and solidarity. So Bertha?
Yes, my name is Bertha Escamilla, and I would just like to say I'm very thankful to be invited to be at this event. I've been out here supporting for my son because he was wrongfully convicted, and he is home now. He served his time, but I'm still out there fighting for justice. There are so many people that are wrongfully convicted because of police corruption, because of judges, prosecutors, and everyone that's in the circle. My son was in a gang, but my son was not a killer. My son was working at the time. My son had 6 months where he was married. He had a 2-year-old daughter who my son was threatened that if he didn't cooperate, they would take his pregnant bitch. This is how the police mentioned this, and charge her, and she would spend the rest of her time in prison, and they would take away my granddaughter. Well, my son didn't want it anymore, and he was forced into making a confession. So, as so many others who are up against this, this is why so many people are in prison today. And we need to do something about this. I think we need to change laws. If the laws are there to protect the police and the judges and the prosecutors, there has to be some kind of laws to help us. And I believe that within that, it's very possible, but we need to do something. We need justice, and we need to get it now. It's been far too long that these men are in prison, and now with this COVID virus, it's just too much for them. They can't handle any more than what's been happening. But I just want to say that I'm so blessed that my son is home. He's been home now, I want to say maybe like 10 years. It's hard for him to go out and get a job because they still treat him as a felon. After serving his time, how much more can a person take? This is ridiculous. We all need to be together. Blacks and Latinos, I've supported forever since I've been out here, because we are involved in this situation, and we are hand on hand trying to help one another to bring the brothers home and the sisters. But we can't do it unless we get more support. And, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead if you had something else there.
I would just like to say, this is how I started with being supportive. I've never known anyone who was in this situation. Nobody does until you get into a situation like this. You can't trust the lawyers always. You can't trust the police, which at the beginning, we all trusted the police, but that was 30, 40 years ago. You can't trust them now. And because of this, I learned and I supported the Black people, because we are in this together, and we are supposed to be, if we get united like it should be, we can do a lot of changes, but we need to be together. We need to be united. This is not a personal issue. This is justice. This is something that they are taking advantage of, and we can't allow this to happen. Please, people, let's get together here. We are brothers and sisters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bertha.
Mm-hmm.
So let me introduce next José López. So José is the director of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, located up around Chicago's Humboldt Park area. He is a lifelong advocate for the self-determination of the Puerto Rican people, both on the island and in the United States. And his leadership against the displacement of peoples through gentrification or through colonialism puts him at the center of any discussion regarding Latinx and Black relations. So, José? Unmute yourself, José. Unmute yourself.
Technology is not my forte, so I just want to make sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Ralph. I want to at least take a few minutes to try to deal with the issue at hand, which is obviously the anti-blackness in the Latino and Latina community. So I want to frame it against the backdrop of a quote by Du Bois in his book, Souls of the Black Folk in 1903. In this book, he says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And it's interesting because I don't think a lot of people understand that Du Bois was really involved in a very, very incredible debate of trying to cope with what was happening right there in the United States. We're talking about the Jim Crow laws. We're talking about, obviously, the whole almost restoration of the enslavement period of the United States with the Plessy versus Ferguson. But he was grappling with the fact that in 1898, the United States had taken over the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Cuba. And he is an anti-imperialist. And so he's also in contact with very important forces like José Martí in Cuba, Vasconcelos in Mexico, Sarmiento in Argentina. And all those intellectuals are grappling with the problem of anti-imperialism, even before people knew what imperialism was, or at least were defining it. There's a wonderful book by David Lewis Brown called Ways of Decolonization, and I would invite everyone to read that book. In the context of the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, he could have gone all the way to the 15th century and said the problem of the 15th century is the problem of the color. And he could have gone to the 21st century and said the same thing, but he would have to stop in 1492. And I want to put at least my thoughts in the context that in 1492, we created a colonial system, which is what the modernity is all about. I would frame the entire past 500 years within that context. There is another wonderful book, which I would invite people to read, called The Darker Nations, and speaking about how the world was divided between the darker nations and obviously the white nations of the world, and how we created a language of white supremacy. And in many ways, our leaders in the independence movement of the 19th century bought into that anti-blackness. And so the discourse in Latin America has been framed in many ways as, you know, very subtle way of not dealing with the blackness, but also not dealing with other forms of dark people like the native people and the indigenous people. And one of the worst things you can be in a country like Peru is un indio, or even in Mexico. So when we look at this language of anti-blackness, we have to contextualize it within the discourse of the wars for independence and the elite that emerges in Latin America that leads much of the discussion. But already Vasconcelos, Sarmientos, and Du Bois, and Hostos in Puerto Rico, Martí in Cuba, are also engaged in that discussion. And so I want to just say that what we should be looking at much more in a profound way are the experiments of the communities of resistance which emerged in Latin America and in the Caribbean, called the Maroon Society. And I would invite us to begin a discussion about our identities in Latin America from the vantage point of Maroon societies. And what were Maroon societies and what did they propose as communities of resistance? There's a wonderful book called Fugitive Modernities by Jessica Crew, which I would recommend people would read because it speaks to the very idea of these fugitive societies, but they were not fugitive, they were actually alternative societies built all over Latin America, and starting with the experiment that Ana Caona began in Haiti and in the Dominican Republic. I'll stop there and then we can enter into more discussions if we want to.
Yeah, that's a very nice historical discussion, Jose, one that we need.
Thank you.
So I want to introduce Fernanda Castellanos. She's our next speaker. She leads OCAD community asambleas, events, and press conferences, and contributes to the base building of the organization and popular education for intergenerational audiences. She got involved with our community organizing efforts after her mom's case, Genoveva, I think. So Fernanda, you want to tell us a little bit?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fernanda, and I'm a community organizer with OCAD, which is Organized Communities Against Deportations, but I also do work with Mi Gente, right? Our work, it's based on deportations, but we noticed that there were like gaps, right? When we were fighting deportation and start making the connections, that the people always fall in deportation because of the connection of racial profiling and the connection with the police and ICE. So we fight for the criminalization of our communities, Black and Brown. We fight deportation, so we try to change the policy piece on the city level, but also like we run campaigns like the Erase the Gang database. We have other campaign, which is like to bring the real sanctuary city right to Chicago. Basically that's what we do. I became involved when my mom was put in deportation proceedings, not for once, but twice, under Obama and then under Trump. So I've been active, and we are here just to empower our people, right? That there's always an option, and we should fight for our people or gente, right, till the very end, that they are not here alone. So OCAD, it's a collective that it's mostly led by women of color and undocumented people. So that's my intro.
Yeah. Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you very much. Cristal Galván, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm muted.
Yeah, unmuted.
Yeah, so I'm Cristal. I'm from Omak, Washington, and I come from a farm worker background. So my parents, they work in the apple orchards in Washington. So I have a BA in ethnic studies and sociology, and I recently graduated from the master's program in Latin American Latino studies at UIC. And my graduate work focused on Afro-Mexican invisibility and the importance of social media and educational spaces in increasing like visibility and awareness regarding Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx populations. And I'm currently working at Purdue University Northwest as a McNair director here. Yeah, just a little bit about myself.
Do you want to give an opening presentation?
Yeah, so I want to thank you for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here. And my perspective is coming from a K-6 lens, but also thinking about like the role that family knowledge plays in contributing to anti-Blackness, like just ideologies, right? So oftentimes racial ideologies and stereotypes are learned through family knowledge and through the institution of education. And in my experience working in K-16, so kindergarten up and through college, so I've been in various roles like a teacher's assistant in a public Washington school, high school, and a teaching assistant in the LALS department at UIC. And through these experiences, I realized that there was either a lack of discussion or absence of Afro-Latinx and Afro-Latin American history, Black-Brown relations, inequality, but more specifically in K-12. And in the beginning of like conversations about ending anti-blackness and Latinx. So, you know, just in this conversation, I want to address two important contributing factors of anti-Black ideologies or ideas. So again, the role of K through 16 and the role of like family knowledge. So it is important through the institution of education that students are exposed to, you know, histories of Afro-Latinx populations, Black-Brown coalitions, and equality, but also have just really substantive conversations about race and anti-Black racism, right, in Latinx communities. You know, and in my experience as a TA at UIC, you know, students are very much open to talk about how race and colorism have impacted them, either indirectly or directly. But I also think that we need to push our students to discuss how anti-Black racism is embedded in our communities, right, in Latinx communities, and the different ways that it's manifested. For example, you know, a great way to talk about anti-Blackness is through the media, right, in popular culture. So we can think about how the novelas that we watch, how they lack Black and Brown representation, but also how Latinidad in the US is portrayed. So oftentimes it's portrayed to be anti-Black or non-Black, right? That Black Latinos don't exist. So we need to push for accurate representation, but also, you know, as educators, to push and have our, like, even little ones and college students think about these different things. And then moving on to like the family, a lot of our social education comes from family or, you know, family knowledge. And it is essential to have conversations about anti-Blackness within our family and friends. For example, those who are familiar with the game La Loteria Mexicana. So it's basically a Mexican version of bingo. So some of these game cards contain some like problematic and offensive images. The game has depictions of like classism, racism, and sexism. For example, there's images of El Apache and El Negrito. So El Apache mocks indigeneity while El Negrito mocks Blackness, and is constructed from blackface ideologies and also the time of like minstrel shows. So in the work that I've done in the past, I've always told folks who are familiar with this game that this is a great starting point to talk about anti-Blackness in Latinx communities, but also the erasure of Afro-Mexicanos in, you know, in within the families, right? So, you know, in conversations with our family, we can discuss, you know, from this image in Negrito that there are Black Mexicans, but, and also how, you know, Afro-Mexicans were just re-included in the census in Mexico, right? So talking about like the erasure of Mexicanos or Afro-Mexicanos, you know, and essentially how the essence of this card is like anti-Black. Lastly, an example is, you know, the idea of mejorar la raza, or bettering the race by partnering with someone who's of lighter skin. So you can have children who are, you know, like light-skinned, which is a common value with our grandparents and parents. And I think it's important to have conversations about this and how this ideology is like harmful and offensive, right? And essentially like anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. So in conclusion, it's important to include Blackness and anti-Blackness in the curriculum in K through 16 to unteach this harmful family knowledge, right? That a lot of Latinx families and communities have. So then our students can disrupt the cycle of anti-Black racism in our communities and our families. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristal. That was wonderful, really. I want to move to our last speaker. I want to introduce our last speaker. This is Mario Lamothe. He's an assistant professor in the departments of Black Studies and Anthropology at UIC. His research involves embodied pedagogies of voodoo and related Afro-Caribbean religious cultures, and the intersections of queerness and social justice in Caribbean sites. Lamothe, I hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly, Mario.
It's perfect.
Okay. Is a performance artist and an LGBTQ rights advocate.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's great to be part of this panel. I think what I'm going to say, and I'm going to thank you to all of you, and especially Jose, López, and Cristal for your presentations. I can just dig right in. I do my research, and I won't go too much into it because it's not directly related to the topic at hand. But I work with Haitian arts practitioners, creative practitioners, and I look at like how Haitians are perceived as voodoo, right? But the word I use to describe that these days is anti-Haitianism, and it's a word that I picked up after understanding the conflict between Dominicans and Haitians. And like this is where the word really rose up as part of our at least political activist vernacular. And so I use that idea of anti-Haitianism really with great thanks to an activist that I met years ago as I was beginning my research, and it's a Haitian Dominican person by the name of Solange Pierre, who was born in Dominican Republic of Haitian parents, and who at age 14 became a tireless advocate for the equal rights and rights protection of Bateas, who are Haitian sugarcane workers in the Dominican Republic. And she also denounced anti-Haitianismo and the unjust deportation and repatriation of Haitian migrants and workers and other Haitians or Haitian Dominicans who were considered undesirable in Dominican Republic. And so she received numerous accolades and recognition for her human rights work, and she passed away in 2011. And it's really thanks to her work, her engagement, her really very much embodied work doing this kind of activist work that I use the word anti-Haitianism. As part of my research also that I sort of dropped, I worked with a group called Border of Lights. It's really a theatrical group. They do oral history project, oral history narratives, or theatrical presentations. But Border of Lights it's an ensemble of Haitian and Dominican folks based in New York City who sort of try to, basically what they do, their collaboration also speaks about coalition building and collaboration between Haitian and Dominicans to sort of undo this idea that all Dominicans are racist against Haitians, right? It's some people, some folks, the state has its own agenda, that some folks in the population recuperate, and those are part of long-standing systemic racist and xenophobic issues. And it's a group that works in New York, but it also travels, and it often works in Haiti and Dominican Republic. But as part of my work at UIC, I teach a course in African diaspora, and that's where perhaps my topic relates to what Jose and Cristal just mentioned. And what I do with that course, when I teach about African diaspora, I look at it from a Caribbean, like from the Caribbean basin standpoint, but I also make sure that I include all those Hispanophone countries or Latinx countries as part of that discourse, that the African diaspora also includes folks in Dominican Republic, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, et cetera, et cetera. And the way I enter through that discourse is to also have the students understand and demystify those Latinx Africanist spiritual practices of Santeria, of Dominican Voodoo, of Candomblé, which are pervasive, you know, and it's sort of like it's the spirit of Africa within Latinx countries, and it's the spirit of Africa that leads to social healing and sort of reparative modes of being. And so it's through that discourse, through that teaching that that the students began to understand what it means to, what is Black or African about Latinx folks. And one quote, and I'll leave you with the quote, and this is the quote that I have the students dig in and work with and play with, especially at UIC, where a good number of my students are Latinx. And I have them play with this quote by Cedric Robinson from Black Marxism. And the quote is, "These cargoes of laborers also contain African cultures, critical mixes and admixtures of language and thought, of cosmology and metaphysics, of habits, beliefs, and morality. These were the actual terms of their humanity. These cargoes then did not consist of intellectual isolates or decultured Blacks, men, women, and children separated from their previous universe." So African labor brought with it a past that has produced and settled it, and it within new elements of consciousness and comprehension. So this is sort of one of the ideas that animate my class in African diaspora studies and how I look at the African religions, especially Santeria, Candomblé, Dominican Voodoo, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, terrific analysis, Mario. Thank you so very much. So we have lots of questions that have started to come in, and I'm going to start asking them. They're coming from you, the audience. So the first question concerns immigration and immigrants. And it suggests, for instance, that when immigrants come to the US, there's a certain kind of idealization, perhaps, about American society. And a kind of unwillingness, or perhaps perhaps not quite enough knowledge yet about the racist structure of the country itself. So when talking about parents, talking about let's say the education of immigrant children, the education of immigrants, et cetera, how does one get across to folks who perhaps have a kind of idealized version of the country? How does one get across this notion of a racist structure within the nation itself? Does anybody want to take that on? Shall I try a kind of a different version of that? Because one of the questions that I was wondering about as Mario and Jose were talking, how do you think of the experience of racism, let's say, in the Caribbean? How does that function versus the sort of racism which functions in other parts of Latin America? And what kinds of what does that finally tell us that we ought to do in terms of education? How about something of that question?
Ivan.
I'll jump in. It's a beautiful dissertation or book question, but I'll jump in. I mean, I would side very much with what Cristal Galván just recommended. Mm-hmm. Sort of a re-education, or perhaps even like a miseducation, like really go about it in a very unruly way to think about race and race ideologies. But I know from a Haitian perspective, as the first American born of Haitian immigrants, I was brought up with the idea of keep your head down, work hard, and you'll get somewhere. Mm-hmm. And all the shenanigans that are happening in the US are not your shenanigans. Not even like the other Black American folks. They're not your problem. That's not your problem, because you keep your head down and you work. But that also means that my Haitian parents came also with their own colorist idea. It's a brown man who married a mulata woman, a mulat in Haiti. That's considered high class to be sort of biracial. And so they do bring this in this hierarchy of sort of like, there's a hierarchy, and we know who we are part of ourselves. But if we just lay low, keep our head down, we'll get somewhere. And I think that's the first thing to begin to dismantle, that there is no laying low, that when you come in the pool, folks are not immediately like concerned about your ethnicity or where you're from, your geographical area. They're like, you're all Black, you're all, you're lumped into categories. So I think there's a miseducation and re-education that must happen, like Cristal recommended.
I would like to say that one of the problems that I see is that the discourse of progress and development is what many of the people that come to the United States have bought into, their American exceptionalism. And so this is something in terms of internalize that we have gotten from a colonial perspective. And really, when we're talking about what Cristal was saying earlier and Mario alluded to, I think that we have to start with the decolonizing of knowledge itself. If we don't undo the very idea of knowledge and what determines knowledge and what are the canons of knowledge, that unless we totally undo that, we've got a serious problem in our hands. And I think that part of the problem, for example, is that and I'm going to say something that may not be so great, but the unions and the Democratic Party created the concept of dreamers to create an incredible division. So they didn't have to deal with the issue of a holistic approach to immigration. And they created these nice little dreamers who embody the American dream, who came obviously not knowing, and their illegal and criminal parents brought them here. This is something we got to fight against, and we got to fight against this American exceptionalism. We've got to. And so I think that's one of the first things we got to do, because it's rooted in that idea of progress and order, which, by the way, was the slogan of the Brazilian movement led by Benjamin Constant, that created the first republic in 1889, which was a racist republic of Brazil. And it's what led the dictatorship, that defined the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz from 1877 until 1910 in Mexico. And that was mejorar la raza. And the only way we could make progress was to become wider and wider in Latin America.
Yeah, I think Cristal is kind of alluding that to that as well. Mejorar la raza is a very powerful thing.
It is.
And any a migrant coming up from Mexico or whatever may very well have that kind of ideology very much built in. There's a question here for Regina and Bertha. Why do you think Black and brown parents from these communities still want and voted to keep police in our CPS high schools? In other words, there's a sense in which we know that how the police function in communities, in Latino communities, in African American communities, is oftentimes a kind of subjugating kind of force. And yet there seems to be, a tendency to kind of want the police within the schools. So is there a way to think about that kind of situation?
Bertha, you want to take that one?
Unmute yourself, Bertha. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. I believe that people feel like they need to have the police there to control the kids there in school. It doesn't make any difference whether it's a Latino or it's a Black school. They just want more support. They want to make sure that nothing's going to happen to their kids. And I mean, with so much things that are going on today, they have this fear. Is it right? I don't know. I don't have any kids that are going to school today. We never had that problem before. So, I mean, it's up to the families to decide if they want that. I mean, in so many schools, you see where kids are beaten, they're taken out of the room like there's some kind of an animal. I mean, it all depends. I mean, I can't really speak for myself, but if I seen that, or to have an officer come and drag the kid out of the room and start pushing him around, I mean, yes, I would be very concerned about that. That's not what their job is. And so it's hard to say, because sometimes you need that control, but not like that. I just don't see why they feel they would have to do something like that. They're only there just to make sure that nothing happens, that there's no weapons or things like that. But it's not for you to come in there and be in control of things. That's not what you're there for. And people, the only ones that people would want them to come in are the ones that I would think that had a problem with their child. And I mean, sometimes there's even rapes that go on or whatever. Where are the police officers then? I mean, don't they see what's going on? So
Yeah.
that's all I have to say about that.
Regina, do you have any further thing to add to that kind of conversation?
I don't think that the police should be in the school systems at all. What happened to the security guards when we were going to school, that they had hall monitors sit in the hall to make sure that you went to your class, that you had the pass to go to the bathroom? Really, what is the purpose of having the police? Young children are usually terrified. The police is not there to protect. They're mostly in the schools. They're slamming the kids up against a locker. They're doing all type of things that's inappropriate. So I don't really understand why parents would want the police in the school. Because if I had a child in school right now, I'll be fighting to get them out of the school. That's not what they need. They need resources in school. Mental health counselors, social workers. They do not need the police. The police are torturing them in their neighborhood, then they're torturing them at school. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, thank you for that one. Maybe this is a good question for Fernanda and maybe Cristal as well. It's a very specific, kind of community organizing question. So in what ways can Black and Brown communities foster coalition building and solidarity against white supremacy?
So what I, Kat, what I try to explain to our members, right, and to the people that we come across, it's that whatever that it's gonna affect the Black community, it's gonna come back to the Latinx community, right? So we need the unity between the two communities. And I always try to give examples so they can really see it, right? Like how if they criminalize Black neighborhoods, it comes to the Latinx neighborhood. And a great example, it's the collaboration between police and ICE. That's how our people end up in deportation proceedings, right? It's not because like Brown and Black people are just like looking for trouble, right? It's just like we get more police in our neighborhoods. If you live in a poor neighborhood, you're more like exposed to be stopped by police, to be harassed, to be just, put in like gang database and deal with all these racist as like, like databases that we don't need. The Chicago gang database alone, it's like 82% of the people in the Chicago gang database, it's Black. It's not because like every single Black person is gang banging. It's just because they just police the neighborhoods that are poor, right? You cannot be hanging around with your friends in the corner because police just assume that you're in the gang database, and actually they don't need to, they don't need any proofs. Like it's at the discretion of the officer. So that's why we keep fighting, and a lot of people just don't understand how racist these databases are, these policies are, and how important it is for us to understand that when we said erase the gang database, it's not like, oh yeah, you are just like defending people that are just causing trouble. No, it's not about that for us, right? It's just bringing attention to these issues, right? That they just criminalize Black and Brown people.
Cristal, do you have something to add to that too?
In my experience, I feel that as far as like when conversations about, you know, like immigration, I feel like Black immigrants are left out of the conversation. And I know a lot of my, you know, a lot of my work deals with like education, but I really think it's important to have dialogue, right? That there are like Black immigrants, but also like just staying connected to like for the folks who are on the panel, like staying connected to the organizations and the work that they do, right? Because these organizers are on the ground, and I think like we can learn a lot, but also again, like just connecting how like our different groups like overlap, right? Like talking about the criminalization of like Black and brown bodies, right? And the importance of like talking, but also like supporting, right, these organizations.
This is and actually a related question, and maybe the community organizers. So you know, that's quite a number of you here on this panel. But are there historical resistances that you all know about regarding you know, resistance to anti-Blackness? Do we have historical organizations? Do we have historical moments when that appeared? And perhaps who were those figures? When did that occur, etc.? José, I thought that might be for you.
Well, I
You've
mean,
been involved in these things historically,
well,
and so I'm kind of wondering what you know, you know, in other parts of the city.
My thing is, first and foremost, most people probably don't even imagine that the Texas Rangers were really the first major white supremacist organization who practiced lynching against Mexicans after the 1820s. As a matter of fact, the independence of Texas is premised on the fact that the Mexican Constitution of 1821 abolished slavery, and it was that Houston and Austin and those guys were rebelling against a system of anti-slavery system that was created in Mexico. And that in actual fact, of the plan of the three guarantees of the Mexican War of Independence, one of those guarantees was obviously instituted in there because of Vicente Guerrero. Vicente Guerrero was the first Afro-Mexican president, but also the second man in the Americas to head a nation state. And most people don't even know that. But the fact is that this man was an amazing figure in Mexican history who led the Batallones de los Negros, which was the most effective military group in the War of Independence. But that said, we lose sight of the fact that Texas is created as a white supremacist state against slavery in 1826 and 1836. So we look at this and we often don't make those connections. We don't make the connections that we have literally thousands upon thousands of Africans from Africa, from Ghana, from Cameroon, that are going through Latin America and crossing the border. Why aren't we talking about those people? Why aren't we talking about the Haitians? Why aren't we talking about Black people that are coming here as so-called illegal aliens, right? So this is part of the discourse that we have to really begin to engage people in. And I think most of us limit ourselves to our own little thing and then look at the broader picture in terms of contextualizing the very problem of migrations across the globe and how that is a product of colonial domination. So I think we gotta really begin to create an anti-colonial dialogue, a decolonizing narrative about the idea of the Black and the Latino and Latina sort of solidarity.
Yeah, this is a question coming for you, Mario. And it concerns those spiritual practices, right? And maybe what we can do is to link up what José just talked about with solidarity and what we're talking about, you know, historical instances in Chicago, you know, with alliances, you know, with resistance alliances and so on and so on. But, you know, putting that aside for a second, solidarity through spiritual practices. And I'm wondering if you have, you know, if you have a kind of an analysis there of spiritual practices coming from Africa, spiritual practices coming from indigenous populations in the Caribbean, you know, in Latin America, and in some fashion or another fusing together to create that kind of spiritual solidarity that might have some sort of political consequence. So that's a huge question, but it's an attempt to link those forces of spirituality, you know, and to bring it to the surface, so that too can be seen as forms of alliance and forms of resistance to, say, racism.
Sure. No. Yes. But one thing I want to add to what you just said, Jose, before I try to take a stab at the question, is that a lot of that anti-colonial practice must also begin at home, in the homeland, right? Because the idea about Guerrero, for example, in my class, the African Diaspora Studies class, when I mentioned that, as a Mexican student was like, I never knew that.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, so there's also the sense like, it's not only when the immigrants arrive here in this land that they have to do that work, but somehow we hope that it begins also at home, and some work begin at home. I think to answer the question, one of the Africanist religions, like the Dominican Vodou, for example, I think it's called 21 Nations, and I know the least about it, but I think it's one of those sort of like Africanist derived practices that tries to do three things, and then again, it gives you an insight into perhaps the Dominican ethos. It's called 21 Nations because it's divided into like 3 sets of nations that have 77 divines or 7 houses in them. One set of nations, like there are the divines from Africa. One set of nations, like at least like 7 of them, 7 houses come from the indigenous Americans. And then the other ones also, like, this is where they try to like bring in the Christianity. And you have those 3 sort of, so they call it 21 Nations to sort of create, or like, to create a sort of equity between the 3 houses. But again, I don't know for a fact that given the and all of those Africanist religions like exist in very sort of Christian Catholic sites. I don't know if it's picked up and has the leverage to become like as a national ethos of coalition building, but I think it tries to do that. Certainly I think in Cuba, the Cuban state has been known. I think it's one of the, as when Cuba wanted to sort of position itself as sort of a cultural producer and cultural ambassador of it. I think it built its legacy upon Santeria, where that became sort of the tool of Castro to show this is what we are as Cuban, and Cuban is an admixture of several cultures, right? I think Santeria is a perfect example of that, where like it used Santeria in its folkloric dances, its music, and its songs, or as something that people can come and witness and practice themselves. So I think Cuba and Santeria are sort of the examples of where those Africanist religions are also used for political purposes.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, I think. I have to admit, there's lots and lots of questions here about solidarity, about historical solidarity, and I think that's what the questions are all trying to probe at that over and over and over and over. So I wonder if we could switch the lens a little bit from spirituality, kind of come back to Chicago. People are asking you, Fernanda, and maybe Bertha as well, Regina as well. They're looking for very specific examples of the things that you have done in terms of this sort of solidarity work, and perhaps things that that you've known about in the past, from others. But I think people really want to know specific things which you have done, and how you think those matters of solidarity can be expanded, at our particular moment. So Fernanda, Bertha, Regina, I think this would be a good one for the three of you.
Yeah, so in OCAD, we give popular education to our members, and we always talk about history, right? How everything started with colonialism and giving them the foundation, because not everyone understands like how, or probably they don't realize how anti-Black they are, right? So we can just not assume that they know or they don't know. So we focus on popular education, and we always open our asambleas like as a safe space for everyone to share and to learn, right? We learn in community, and we have to unlearn to learn again, right? There's a lot of things that we have to unlearn. Like an example with my parents, right? Sometimes I have to be checking them and be like, no, don't say el negrito, because I don't care if you're calling me like, you know, like, oh, estás bien negrita, you know, because I've been working on, and I said, and they said, it's with love. And I said, no, you just don't say that, right? So having these conversations and just checking our friends, family, you know, when they said something, some things that are anti-Black, it's really, you know, those small things that we can start doing and changing, because that's how we're gonna create the change and bring, you know, the attention to how anti-Black we are. Because it's the ideology that we grew up, right? Like Crystal was mentioning, growing up, you watch novelas and it's always like, you know, the darker skinned people, it's always like the servant or the one who's causing trouble. So you grew up with that. Then you turn on the media, and like my mom, like she watched Univision and Telemundo, and I'm like, no, they are giving the wrong information. So with Mi Gente, we started a campaign against Univision and Telemundo for not reporting the news the way they were on May when the looting and the protesting were happening, right? They always focus on like, oh yeah, the George Floyd got killed because he was resisting arrest. Like, it's his fault, right? The background, they always dig into these things. And what I always remind my loved ones, it's like, it doesn't matter what you're doing. We have, you know, different systems that they have to go through. No one deserves to die. No one deserves to, you know, just be murdered by police. So we always have these conversations in our spaces, and this is not new. We had OCAD was formed in 2013, I wanna say, and since the very beginning, we were very clear that we wanted to bring attention to these, right? Always give popular education, and our asambleas or members are very we have all ages, right? Intergenerational. So we have to always be reminding older folks, younger folks, how do we have these conversations to bring the change? An example, I live in Berwyn, and most of you probably know what happened in May, right? When the looting started happening here. These Latinos, I don't know from where, came up, said, I'm gonna protect the hood. And I'm like, where you at when ICE comes around, right? You're not protecting anything. So the fact that some of the people, you know, just wanna come out and just assault people for no reason, and being anti-Black, right? Saying like, no, these are criminals, these are not protesters, and things like that. I'm like, no, this is like when we need the unity. We need to be together in these. So it was really beautiful to see how, like, after a night of like certain situations happening in Cintron and Berwyn, we came together, and actually like a lot of the Latinx like people that live here were giving rights to Black people to safe places, you know, picking up groceries, and just like doing those small things, and, you know, sharing with your friends and be like, hey, let's help on these. That helps a lot, you know, that helps a lot. So that's what we've been doing, but it's something that we always talk about, like Afro-Latinos or gente that ends up in deportation, it's because you get racial profile. The darker you look, most likely you're gonna end up in deportation proceedings. So that's some of the work we do.
Yeah, Cristal, you were involved in some very specific kinds of actions, weren't you? Particularly when the protests, uprisings began. Weren't you addressing those things with another group?
I mean, the conversations that we had was just in LALS. And basically, you know, like how, at least in UIC, like how can we support like, you know, our Black brothers and sisters in regards to the institution, right? Like I know at UIC, you know, the Black undergrads and graduate students, they had their list of demands. So making sure that we supported, you know, Black students at UIC, but also like across the country, right? That they're receiving the support at, you know, the university, but also in their local like communities, right? So that's the work that I did specifically, was just, you know, supporting student demands, right, during the Black Lives Matter protests.
Yeah. Back to Bertha and to Regina. Again, just wondering, you know, specific things that your groups have been doing in order to create these forms of solidarity. Would like to share some of those?
Yes. Our groups are out there trying to get community control with CPAC, because we believe that we need to have this in order to keep the police in line, to make sure that if there's anything that's wrong, they will be charged with crimes. If they are accountable, they should, you know, they should be charged for it. Community control is to be able to hire and fire anyone who has a pattern of being bad, you know, and it would delete the FOP. And I mean, they have not done their job all these years. And why do we need them? I mean, all they're doing is complaining about what we do. You know, we are only trying to get justice. We have not received justice, and we cannot get justice, not in the courts or anywhere. So this is why we need to have the alliance to have community control of justice. And we have like 50,000 signatures from citizens throughout the city of Chicago demanding for us to have the community control. And so we're still fighting for this, and eventually we will have it. I mean, this cannot keep on going. I mean, this is a racial profile that they're doing with the Latinos and the Black people. And it doesn't, you know, it doesn't change, it gets worse. And they think that because they have a badge and carrying a weapon that they can go and stop you and do whatever. No, that's not true. And this is why we have so much violence today, because they think they can do whatever they want with you. We need to have these laws change. I think we need to get over and beyond the number of petitions that we need to have to change these laws. And I mean, we have patterns and everything to show, videos to show what they do. I mean, I remember growing up, I don't remember seeing that many people killed or even seeing people killed from the police. They were always wrestled down to the ground. They were, if they got shot, it was in the leg to stop them. It was nothing like shooting them 7 times in the back. I mean, Where is, you know, the job also consists of stopping them, putting their arms around them. You don't need 4 or 5 police officers to be on top of someone. I mean, that's outrageous.
Yeah, I noticed.
If you can't hold one person down and you're overweight, I mean, you don't belong there. You really don't.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is not just here, you know, in Chicago. This is all over the country. This is happening too. So, I mean, it's not like, you know, we are complaining about this, and this is ongoing. This is ongoing. I mean, and people are tired of seeing this. I mean, it's wrong to be out there looting and that, but it's wrong because people are tired of this. They need to make some changes. And if this is the way they need to show it, who's to say who's right or who's wrong? But the thing is, we need to stop it. We need to stop doing this now, and we need to charge the officers. They talk about us going, getting away with murder. Well, what are they doing? I mean, come on. If you go to jail for 6 months to a year or something because you killed someone, is that right? No, it's not. And
let me ask
don't look at that.
Let me ask a related question, and I'm going to maybe ask Regina about this one, because I think what Bertha is trying to capture here is just this whole kind of network of enforcement, police enforcement. One of the questions here, I'm going to ask Regina on this one. We noticed, for instance, that there were ICE agents that were stopping Black Lives Matter, for instance. We know that there has been a kind of a confluence of ICE, you know, deportation kinds of interests with local law enforcement. And I'm wondering, that is both a, that's an enormous kind of alignment of what I would call at least carceral entities. In other words, entities, of the nation state that are involved in incarceration. But it's coming from ICE, which is thought about typically as matters of deportation. Mm-hmm. And it's also coming from local law enforcement, which is supposedly a matter of domestic policing. Mm-hmm. So the confluence of those kinds of things seems to me completely fascinating and the start of a kind of solidarity. Anyway, Regina.
Okay, the Blacks and the Latinos, we operate on the understanding that we all are bearing the same root of state violence. And none of our voices are being heard, so we need to band together because we can only do this together. We can't do it by ourselves, so we have to band together, and so that's what we're doing. We have individuals like Esther and Charlie Hernandez. Their 2 sons have been in prison, wrongly convicted and tortured for so many years. You have Amanda Shackelford, her son. We've been to Wisconsin regarding that incident. So we all share similar problems related to racial profiling and policing. We understand each other's issues of incarcerated children and forms of solidarity, forms of basic solidarity. We fully understand that both of our communities are impacted not only with ISIS and police torturing. So we support each other in the streets, in the courtroom, and with government officials. We are mother activists, mother survivors with children that are incarcerated, trying to end the state violence. So we have to band together. We just have to. It's a must. We need to stop it. We have to stop it the best way we can, and we have to take to the streets. We don't condone the looting and the violence. We do it peacefully. And normally that looting and violence is not from the peaceful protesters, not from our group. Yeah. They come from outside the city and from the suburbs that come in, get in the midst of everybody, and then do their thing after everybody's gone.
I have a very specific question for José. On a number of occasions, people have been asking for maybe 2 or 3 titles of books just very quickly. People would like to know some of the things that you were referencing.
So the book that I was referencing, Fugitive Modernities, is by Jessica Krug. And it's a really, really interesting discussion on maroon societies. The Darker Nations is a book by Vijay Prashad, and it's part of the People's History of the Third World. It's a really good look at the colonial question and the division of the world between, obviously, the darker nations and the white nations. Ways of Decolonization is a book by David Louis Brown, and it's a discussion about sort of the intersectionality of some of the practices of colonialism in the anti-colonial discourse of Du Bois and other intellectuals of the Americas at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And there's a wonderful new book that was written by a young anthropologist, Jonathan Rosa, that I would like for people to read. It's called Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race. So that's about the question of racializing language in the schools of the United States, and particularly in Chicago.
Yeah. Here's kind of like a very large question, I think. And some people have noted this. The Black Lives Matter movement seems to be a kind of global movement. You know, when the first demonstrations were occurring, the first protests here in the United States, there were simultaneous protests occurring in Europe, for instance, and in stranger places than Europe, you know, when one starts thinking about Black Lives Matter. And that raises questions there also about solidarity. I wonder if anyone has any thought about a kind of, I don't want to make too much of this, but a kind of, the emergence of a kind of proto solidarity around issues of Blackness and a kind of historical, global, even almost planetary history there of subjugation and the world itself responding to that. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that all you have to look is at all of the things that occur in many areas of the world, but in Latin America, about Columbus and the Columbian statues. But what happened, for example, in Uganda, what happened in many parts of Africa, right, during that movement in solidarity with what was happening here, were the statues of the colonial figures in all over Africa were also being knocked down and destroyed. What happened in Australia, and particularly around the issue of the Aborigines and the police relations with the Aborigine, and even in areas that we don't know very much about, like Kanak and the so-called New Caledonia in the South Pacific. For me, I've been very moved by that demonstration of solidarity, but its linkage to an anti-colonial discourse. That, to me, is the greater part of this.
Mm-hmm. Mario, do you have any thoughts on this?
My question would be, yes, you might want to look at it in as the emergence of a sort of a planetary sort of you might want to look at it this way, and I think you can, because of course, oftentimes movement, happen alongside as a result of emerging from, moving through. But I'm also like, the question that your question provokes for me is, I wonder to what extent there are connections being made between those movements. It's not like I'm doing that in isolation over there and you're doing it over here. To what extent we are like interlocking somehow, so we can actually make that like grow, expand, and give that sort of whatever planetary movement strength, right, and might. Because then it still feels like the divide and conquer thing will happen much more easily if you look at it in isolation, rather than as interlocking movements around sort of Black and brown bodies, right? So that's the question. I'm wondering what connections are being made, and I don't know, or even and it's I think it's one of those things that actually has been brought up, that like the movements for Black Lives, that they have been able to maintain like connection between all the chapters in the U.S. But what connections are being made with chapters outside of the U.S., right? So I don't know the answer to that question, but I think when dialogues are happening in this way, then things might be stronger, emerge more from those interactions.
Yeah.
But I just like to add that I think we also have to, what I like about Mario is also how do you, his statement is how do we sort of make these movements and recognize their organicness. So one of my big problems, for example, is a discourse in large part of the sort of the Caribbean, and particularly with the writings of C.L.R. James, where he talks about the Black Jacobins. And I always say, wait a minute, before there was a Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, there was a Macandal. Macandal speaks to a longer history of struggle and obviously of maroon resistance than Toussaint Louverture. So for me, it's always kind of, you know, how Eurocentric we sometimes look at movements, and how sometimes, even in our own movements, we're driven by some discourse that tries to sort of look at it in a global context when we don't recognize the particularities of those movements. So I'm really like Mario's intervention on this.
So I'm wondering, you know, going back to the activists in Chicago, you know, and all of the things that they've been doing. Are they sensing that this is a kind of a transformative moment? Are they sensing that American society perhaps finally is beginning to face these sorts of, you know, this sort of, you know, racist structures? Or is this just going to disappear? You know, 2 years from now, the pandemic will be over. Things will kind of come back to normal. The police will not be defunded, for instance. Things will just kind of return. Or is there something more fundamental, do you think, that's going on? And, you know, all of us are seeing that Black Lives Matter, you know, it's probably the group that's pushing this more than anything else. And today we're trying to argue, well, you know, it's also solidarity between Latinx, you know, and Black Lives Matter, et cetera, and maybe that will make it even more forceful. But are things really, really changing? Do you have that intuition, or do you think things are going to come, you know, return, even like a few years from now? Maybe this is mostly for Fernanda, Bertha, Regina again, Cristal maybe.
I can go. So I think that through like building coalitions, but also just in our current moment, I think that we are invoking change, right? But I think it's important to know that it's not going to happen overnight. And I know like a lot of, you know, just a lot of scholars too, like that argue that we're still in the civil rights era, like the civil rights era hasn't ended. And I completely agree with that, right? Like we are in change with like building solidarity. And an example that I can think of is that I'm from a really small like rural town in like Washington, right? Like nobody knows it. However, it's, you know, it's a predominantly white area, but half of the town sits on a Native American reservation, right? And what I think about is that during the Black Lives Matter protest, like my town held a Black Lives Matter protest with a few, you know, like Black folks who live in the town, but also Jamaican immigrants, right? Because the town also has Jamaican immigrants working in the apple and cherry harvest, right? So I'm thinking of, this is a space that usually wouldn't have a protest, right? But I'm thinking that we are creating change. It's not, unfortunately, it's not going to happen overnight, but we need to continue, you know, working on the, you know, on the ground, but also like through education, right? Yeah, so those are my thoughts.
Yeah. So someone else, Bertha?
Yes, I agree with Crystal. It's not going to happen overnight. There's just too much that needs to be done. But at the same time, it's not going to stop. This has gone too far, and we've lost out on too much. When you look back through the years, back from the 90s, where John Burge and all of his detectives were out there doing, you know, torturing people and things like that, and nothing has happened. It's changing, but it's not enough. But if it wasn't for the public to be out there in support of putting this man to jail, it's just unfortunate that the time expired for him to be charged for murder, or, you know, instead he was charged for perjury. But things are going to change, and I'm hoping it's going to be a big change. It's things like Black Lives Matters, and more newer groups are coming out. And I believe with the help of the Latino organizations to come aboard and be involved with all of us, could make things a lot better. I mean, there's a lot of Latinos that are out there supporting when there's a shooting or whatever happens. And they're out there supporting because they know what the police did, and they know that they're wrong. And it's probably because they've experienced it. I mean, it's like back in 1967, there was this young man who was killed by 3 officers. And this was in the Pilsen area, no, the Brighton Park area, where the cop had the knee over his neck, just like with George Floyd. And we protested, but nothing actually came out of that. And that's so sad. It's just like Vanessa Gillian over in Texas, how all them victims are killed, were murdered, and nothing's happening there. That is so sad that more of this has not come out. It is so sad.
I think this is what you're saying, Bertha, is incredibly important. You know, this kind of historical legacy of continuing actions, you know, that we're still, you know, that is still with us in some fashion or another, so that the present is a kind of constant repetition, you know, of the past in some fashion. And I guess that's the reason I was asking that question about, you know, is this finally a transformative moment? There has been so much of this past, and your ability to conjure up specific dates in which an action looks almost the same as it looks, you know, according to things that, you know, that are happening right now. I think that's really important to have that kind of historical grasp. So Regina, I think we're kind of coming to the end of 5:30, but I wonder, Regina, do you also have some, you know, some sense of this being a transformative moment? And Fernanda, do you also have some sense of this?
Yeah, I think people, a lot of people didn't even realize that Black and brown people were experiencing this type of violence and torture until they actually saw it for their own eyes. That's why people came out in all walks of life. It's different for somebody to hear but to actually see somebody with somebody that's supposed to be serving and protecting our community on somebody's neck, and you seeing that person take their last breath, and he's just very callous about it, like he was like kneeling on the ground, like the man was like nothing. So yeah, it's all coming together. This is something that's been brewing for a long time, and it's not getting ready to go away. It's going to be here for a while until we see some change. But we have to see some change. And we're out here in the streets. We're fighting for justice and human rights for everybody, for the torture victims, for the wrongly convicted. And we need to put the power back into the hands of the Black and brown community. The police are supposed to be there to serve and protect us. On the side of that car, that's what it says, but it's not serving and protect the people of the community that they're policing. It's only serving and protect the rich people, the billionaires. They need to be serving and protecting us. We should not be terrorized in our own community when we see them. That's not how it should be. So we have to take it back. So we want people to get involved. That's what we want. You either call your aldermen, write your alderman, go to their office and tell them that you want them to back the legislation for CPAC. And let them know if they do not back it, their election is coming up. Yeah. Then we'll get somebody else in there that will back that legislation. But we need to do something with the police officer. Now, I'm not saying that some of them are not good police officers. Some of them are, but for most part, they're not. It's a secret group. They know what somebody is doing and nobody does anything about it. And they don't get the same punishment that they try to get on somebody else, and they lie and they convicted people that have never did anything. They torture them to get a confession for them to get a promotion, as I understand.
Yes.
Yeah. So Fernanda, I just want to give you the last word, Fernanda, on, is change coming or not from your perspective?
Yes, I think change is coming. The fact that we're seeing that Latinx people is getting murdered by police too, and like no one else is talking about it. I'm seeing unity, and I see now how we're bringing like more collaboration to the table, and I'm just excited because I think the change is coming. And this year was like, okay, wake up and start collaborating with the Black and brown communities. And it's just, I really like how now we're working together in bringing this unity and working on the same issues, right? That they affect both of us, like Bertha was mentioning too, and Regina. Like not only Black people, it's affected by police torture, right? It's Latinos too. When you get arrested or when police come to the door and you're undocumented, they force you to like tell them things that sometimes are not true, and they take you. People end up in deportation.
Yeah, I think, well, we've come to an end of our time here. So I personally want to, thank all of the speakers for their really wonderful presentations, and obviously thank the audience for all of their questions. I think this has been an important discussion. Obviously, it's one that seems so completely significant, not just to our specific moment, but to kind of like long chunks of history. José's, discussion there about 1492, and so on, and Mario's discussions also about, African spirituality, that long history of, of things mixing together and of kind of creating, pockets of resistance based on alliance. I think this is all really kind of important. So I want to thank the audience and thank the speakers and hope to see you again soon.